Hi, my name is Glenn Morgan. Thank you for joining us again for another We the Governed interview. And it's my pleasure to be interviewing Representative Jenny Graham, representative from the 6th Legislative District, and just elected in 2018. And basically, I'm really eager to come out and after seeing you in the legislature now for a couple of years, you've really become known as an advocate for victims' rights and all issues related to kind of crime and punishment in Washington State. And if you could, just for our audience, tell me what got you so interested and focused on this as a policy area and be such a strong advocate for victims in Washington State.
Well, I would say that I've just fallen into this naturally. Sometimes, we have things that happen in our life that we don't have control over. And I just have found myself, my sister was a Green River murder victim, and I also am the mom that worked on my own time and at my own expense, driving back and forth to Olympia to reform child sexual assault statutes of limitations. And, that's just something that came out of life experience. Being, that child and growing up and then recognizing what statutes of limitations are and understanding at that point in time that when a justice system tells you that as a child you should have reported abuse within a year, and if you didn't report it, regardless of whether your life was threatened, like what happened with me, or your pets, or people you love, the justice system didn't take that into consideration. And that just, and again, my case was one of those cases where I had police reports, school reports, neighbors that called in. It just, the amount of evidence that I had was so overwhelming that, I actually had lawyers that said, your old case has more evidence than a lot of new cases right now, but because of that unfair statute of limitations, I was denied justice.
And what era were you working in on making these reforms in Washington State? Because that was before you were in the legislature. That was when you were a citizen. Roughly, what was the time frame you were working on that?
So time frame, it started probably about 2011, where I really kind of got decided to make the change. But if we kind of go back even a little further to 2008, I made a cold call one day, and this had to do with my sister's murder with the Green River serial killer. He'd been caught, he was in jail. When all of that was going on, I just shut everything off. I wasn't reading newspapers, radio, TV. I just disconnected from everything. And I had to go through my own healing period, and then I got to a point where I was just really curious. I had so many questions, and I just decided there were things that I needed to know. And so I started asking questions, and part of that path was picking up the phone, making the cold call to Tom Jensen. So he was a detective with King County. And I simply asked, is it possible for me to see my sister's death investigation files? He made a split-second decision that had a huge impact on my life. He allowed me to come and look through those binders, and there were 6 of them that were that thick. And I spent 3 weeks going to the major crimes unit, not disturbing anybody, but just going through and just reading, where was she? What was going on? Things that I just didn't know. And, it was quite amazing to see all of that information, to also, witness going to the room that they had where all of these black binders were just lined up. And these were all the victims. And, while I was sitting there and I was working, there were times that it was incredibly hard. There were a few times that I honestly thought that I was going to throw up, when I was reading through information. It was hard. But I also had an opportunity, because there were things that were going on around me. that I was hearing about child abuse cases, you know, things like that. And so it was quite eye-opening, and I don't know, there's just something that communicated to me when I started looking into this, that the truth matters. And it seemed like every door that had been closed before just started opening. I mean, I was making calls that I called Gary Ridgway's defense attorney.
The Green Remitter himself.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
It's like, who does that?
Right.
So I not only called him, I went to go talk to him. You know, and my focus was, I had questions. We had a black binder that we received as families members from the prosecuting attorney's office. But honestly, you know, those were questions that they asked. As a family member, I had my own questions that were never answered. And I thought to myself, okay, you know, I've never committed any crimes. I'm very definitely of sound mind. I know what it is that I need to be able to heal, and that is that I've got to face this head on. So I'm going to just make these calls. I'm going to see, you know, where this goes. And it did wind up with me going to Walla Walla and having about a 4-hour conversation with Mr. Ridgway, closer than we are sitting right now. And, you know, I can't tell you again how incredibly hard that was to try to carry on a conversation and keep him engaged while I had the grief of not only my sister being murdered, but friends that I also knew that he murdered as well. And as I'm having this conversation as the sister, it's this grief that I'm having to try to push it down while I'm talking. And but anyway, I did it, and I'm much better for doing it.
And I think, you know, having that kind of an experience, not just the trauma of being a family member, you know, dying from such a horrible crime, but also being a clear victim of the whole crime situation, and then basically having this activity of a closure in your life, that appears to be the point that moved you into more of an activism sort of role, where you decided that you were going to make a difference.
See, and when you mention closure, that's an important component, because I remember when the sentencing was going on, and I remember sitting in that courtroom, and it just seeming so cold and so sterile, and the victims were just names on a piece of paper.
Right.
I mean, that is genuinely how it felt. I remember sitting in there just screaming inside, because it was just name after name. I mean, they weren't recognized as people, you know, as human beings. And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, well, what does closure mean? What exactly does that mean? You know, and I remember I went and I actually picked up I picked up a dictionary. I went to a store, and I was like, you know, I genuinely was a little, I don't want to say traumatized is not the right word, but I think just genuinely, you know, not exactly sure what it meant. And so I looked up the definition, and the definition of closure is what my sister's murderer did to his victims. He put closure to their life. He erased them as human beings. So as family members, we are given an unfair life sentence. There's no closure for us. There's no parole. We live with this forever. And when I think of closure, this is for the police that are investigating the case. It's for the community that was being traumatized when this murderer, you know, nobody knew who he was.
Right. I mean, I grew up in that area, and I remember it was always hanging over your head whenever you went to the park. You know,
this is, we know who did it.
Yeah.
We know what happened. This is closure for everybody else. So what I have been able, this is like coming around full circle for me, in that I recognize that what I was seeking was resolution.
Okay.
Resolution is having answers. Resolution is knowing that when an anniversary comes up that law enforcement and everybody else doesn't have to deal with, that pain is there. It just never goes away. I'd like to say time heals it, does not. Maybe that's not everybody's case, but for me, it just doesn't. And
but that experience has really put you in a fairly unique position, I think, as an activist, and now as an elected official, to address this issue on behalf of victims. Because I've heard, from other people around the state that you've really become known as a victims' rights advocate in Olympia, particularly considering recent events with early release of criminals, with concerns that they're going to potentially get sick in jail, or even more dramatically, the recent court case in Olympia where it looked like they might even be releasing Gary Ridgway early.
That was possible.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, it was.
What can you explain kind of how some of that situation has impacted you lately? So
yes, and again, I will bring this back just a little bit. There was, in the not too distant past, your viewers may remember that they moved Gary Ridgway to Colorado.
Right.
And the reason that they moved him was they said that they were worried about his mental health. Okay, right. Keep in mind, the man is convicted of murdering 50 human beings one at a time.
Right.
A lot of them were children. And the detectives that I've talked to, they said they've got him for probably at least 70. So this man, they're moving now to Colorado. They're not putting him in AdMax, which is the worst of the worst. They're putting him in general population. So he can have a job, he can have privileges, all of those things that they told us in the plea bargain were not going to happen. So that's another thing that was the straw that broke the camel's back for me running for office.
Okay.
That was just, and then having Governor Inslee not speaking to victims' families.
Right.
Because he refused to do it. As an elected official, I have had meetings scheduled with him, and he's canceled those meetings.
So Governor Inslee wouldn't even meet with victims' families.
No, what he did was he had an attorney that met with victims' families.
Okay.
And within, I think it was like the next day or the day after that, that's when he announced the moratorium on the death penalty. So he never himself met with any of us. He said he did, but he did not. And he already had it very clearly in his mind that this was what he was going to do.
And there was a lot of anger recently, and I admit I'm in the crowd that was incredulous about what was going on, where they had this case went to the Supreme Court about the possibility of releasing I think it was 11,000 criminals.
12,000 plus.
12,000, yeah, with the potential that they might get, they might catch COVID in prison, but yet these were people with significant violent histories, and they had been put in prison, and releasing them in the community it seemed like such an absurd situation. And I'm sure you were involved in conversations about that.
Well, absolutely. Number one, when you have somebody like Gary Ridgway that targets and hunts other human beings for sport and murders them for entertainment, I should have never, our family should have never been even having to worry that was going to be a possibility. And I know that there are people out there that say, oh, they would never do that. Well, I'm sorry, there were 3 categories and they didn't have to fit all 3, just one. And if they release even one murderer, why do they think that it's okay to release this murderer and not this murderer? He would have had a leg to stand on.
Right.
So we should have never even been there at that point. So let's go back to the Supreme Court case.
Right.
The Supreme Court did not order the inmates to be released. What they said was that you need to take reasonable actions to protect the inmates from possibly getting COVID.
Right.
Well, I would like to meet any single one of us that has a 100% guarantee that we can't catch a virus.
Right.
Unless they put us in a room all by ourselves with nobody coming in there, and then they'd be complaining that how cruel and unusual that is.
Yeah, for solitary confinement.
Okay.
Right? Yeah.
So what they said is you need to make reasonable actions to make sure that you are watching out for their safety. Well, this isn't the first virus or flu that we've had. Our correction system already had a protocol in place which is number one, I think why they were so successful, that we had still not had a single inmate that has died from COVID. And at the time this was happening, there were a handful, maybe as many as 8, I think, at that time in one facility.
Up in Monroe,
In
right?
Monroe.
Right.
Okay, this was not statewide spread. We didn't have inmates dying. They were actually, one could argue, safer there. Because the bottom line is, if you're letting them out for their safety, we had deaths out in the general public. They didn't in the correction system. We had more people with COVID out here than in here. And I was asking, I sent a letter to the governor's office and to DOC asking, what is your plan? We have a housing shortage. We have people that are losing their jobs. Where are they going to live? How are they going to support themselves?
Right.
And what about the secondary programs to help them be successful? Mental health, their medicine, those are greatly restricted right now or closed.
Right.
So what's your plan to make sure they don't become homeless? Because if you're moving them from here, saying that you're worried about it, and they become homeless, I'm sorry, it just no reasonable person is going to believe that that's a reasonable argument for why they should have been released.
And yet 4 of our Supreme Court justices thought it was pretty reasonable.
So this was the court case, and it was the inmates, the people that were acting on Columbia
Columbia
Legal Services or something. Right. Anyway, they filed a lawsuit.
Right.
And I'm going to point out that they filed that lawsuit, I believe, with taxpayer dollars, from what I'm understanding.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
But where were the taxpayer dollars for the victim side?
Right. Arguably, right, the AG would say that they were defending the Department of Corrections, but
Okay, no.
Okay.
Yeah, and that might be, like I said, if that actually really happened. But, as far as standing up for the victims, the crime victims and their families, and being in the bird seat at ground level, seeing exactly what is going on in that committee, we need to change this. So that's who I am. I'm fighting for balance in our justice system.
And you sit on 2 committees in Olympia that deal with law and justice. Can you explain that a little bit? What your role is on those committees and what their role is and how that affects victims in crime? Right.
So public safety is pretty explanatory. We deal with legislation that involves people that commit crimes, if they're incarcerated. So the committee deals with a lot of that kind of stuff. The civil rights and judiciary, that is a different committee. We don't really deal with crime, but we have the landlord-tenant issues. We have all the gun bills that have come through.
Okay.
We did hear about domestic violence. So there's any number of different types of cases. Civil rights and judiciary is a pretty busy committee.
And it's between those 2 committees that most any reform, whether that's efforts to change the statute of limitations or changes in crime and punishment in some way, it tends to come through one of those 2 committees in the legislature.
Right.
Okay.
So when we bring this back to the justices saying, that there is an emergency for them to take this action, and I was asking where the emergency was then. I'm still asking where the emergency was then and is now, because we had, as a state, other very viable options that these inmates did not have to be released. There were facilities that were public-owned facilities. They could have brought in RVs, which could have taken some that are, were vulnerable to keep them safe. There were tents that our military uses that are actually pretty nice, climate controlled, and they might have been able to use them for other things later. But the point is that we had a handful of people that they said that were infected at Monroe.
Right.
And it is important to protect everybody's safety. That includes the staff, the corrections staff, their families. These were things that were in my mind. So when I'm looking at this whole scenario and I'm saying, okay, how do we protect them? And I'm thinking to myself, this protection could come in this form. It also helps to protect corrections officers, when we're talking about spacing.
Right.
But then there is, the safety of our community.
Right.
That also has to be first and foremost.
And it doesn't seem that that's ever much of an issue. They recently released over 1,000 early release.
And that was
criminals.
Governor Inslee that made that, his
Right.
sole decision.
Right.
He did not consult law enforcement. He didn't consult the legislature. He did not also consult the crime victims on
Right.
the other side of those crimes. And to add salt into an open wound, what he did was he said, and again, nobody's died, a handful of people, there's just no time to notify victims
Right.
of these crimes.
Right.
So, and there's a constitutional mandate that they have to. And, where we were coming back saying is, it doesn't matter what it is that's going on, unless maybe the building is burning down or something, and
Sure.
then you move them to a
Different facility, but
you
yeah.
don't release them.
Right.
The victims still are entitled to their constitutional rights.
Well, and I know that this kind of comes on top of a scandal that had been brewing in the Department of Corrections, where they had a computer glitch that was releasing early release criminals. I believe felons, that they had released over 5,000 of them, if I remember right. It was spread over a number of years.
13 years.
13, yeah, and they knew about it, and they didn't even, and it was generally focused on actually violent felons that were being released early, because they were, the glitch hid additions to their sentence that had been added based on things like using a firearm in a crime or something like that. And there seemed to be no hurry, no effort to change. I know they fired some people eventually, but all those people released, I know in many cases people were murdered by some of these released felons.
There were at least 2 murders that
Right,
I know
at least
of.
2 that I'm aware of, yeah, that within the window of time they would have otherwise been behind bars
Right.
still. And so there does seem to be a tendency lately, in particular, and this is the state, Washington State's the one that came up with 3 strikes and you're out. And yet it seems like we're going backwards on some of these efforts to hold criminals to some degree accountable and pay attention to victims. And that's really where you've been advocating very strongly in Olympia on these subjects.
Well, so the last 2 sessions I
Yeah.
have been the strong person that's been standing in the way of ending the death penalty. For obvious reasons, it should be used sparingly, for the worst of the worst. I am working on reform to make sure that we keep it, but then also to protect them from eliminating life without the possibility of parole, which would have taken 3 strikes with it. So that means that no matter what crime you committed, no matter how heinous, there would be no death penalty, no life without the possibility of parole. A life sentence, if you talk to just about any prosecutor, is 15 years. It's 13 years and 4 months with good behavior. So, and I know this because there was an inmate that murdered Linda Strait here in Spokane that was up for parole. And I was asking, he only spent 13 years and 4 months in prison. How does this work? He kidnapped her, he raped her, he strangled her, and he threw her in the river. He got away with it for 24 years, I believe. But how do you commit that crime and only get 13 years?
It's a great question. And what was their answer? I mean, what have they had?
Well, this is the system,
Right.
that they have that set up. And
Right.
and again, from being on the other side of this, I think that one of the other things that I am really going to be fighting for is truth in sentencing. When that family comes into court and they're told that it's a 20-year sentence, it needs to be a 20-year sentence. So as far as I'm concerned, instead of giving them time off for good behavior, it should be, if you don't toe the line, you're going to get extra time.
Sure.
Right?
Yep. And I think that would be very, those are usually quite popular reforms, actually.
Yeah. I mean,
But it seems like
they have to, so
away.
what's happened in our justice system is we have gone from what the system was meant to be, which is accountability and justice. Okay, though that should be that is the first and foremost center pin of everything. What's happened now is we have a justice system that's kicked justice and accountability over here and in place is rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is not justice or accountability for the crime victims or survivors. So on the flip side of that, though, I am still honestly that person that believes that if somebody commits a crime, they own up to it, they better themselves while they're serving their time, and they get out and they do not continue to make more victims, I will support them. I will be their biggest fan because I want to see them succeed. It's the ones that continue to keep making more victims that, again, I'm saying, we cannot have a situation where, and I'm sitting on the committee, so I see the legislation that's coming through that I have to vote on that is making it so that they are allowing the people that are committing the crimes to blame everybody else, not take accountability for their choices, because it's a choice. And then our state is providing them wraparound services that the taxpayers are forced to pay for. They don't get a choice in whether they're going to support that or not. So these wraparound services are going to the people that are committing the crimes, right? And then they're working to pass legislation that will go in and expunge their records.
Right.
So
nobody will even know what they've done.
So I'm just kind of wrapping my brain around this and thinking, okay, well, you let them blame everybody else. You make somebody else pay for their wraparound services, including college education. And then you expunge their records so that the average person doesn't know if they're a serial rapist or a murderer, that they're moved so that they can protect themselves. Right. That's what's wrong, is there's no accountability and there is incentive for them not to change. Why would they? And, on the flip side of it, victims and survivors, there's very little resources for them. The expectation is for them to go through a justice system that tells you this is what the sentence is, but then they change it down the line and you don't have any say in it. And the message is, if you don't like it, that's too bad. It's your fault. It's your problem. Get over it.
When you are discussing these issues with victims and victims' families and people who are, share the same concerns, and you're trying to represent that in Olympia, what's kind of the message that you want to give to them as far as what they can do to make a difference? People who care about these issues, and I think that there's a lot more people out there than we realize, than is commonly realized. What can they do to make a difference, if you had a message for them? So
the message and this is me just living the experience, and recognizing that there is a strong message that does need to surface and be recognized. And that message is that we need to bring the pendulum back to finding balance in our justice system, that we absolutely can have and should have justice with accountability and rehabilitation for those that are willing to do the work that they need to do and willing to do their part when they get out. The ones, though, that are not, and they do exist, we need to be able to work to keep them managed so that they are not allowed to get out and hurt other people, especially when they show a propensity to do it. I have been saying that for a long time. At what point in time do we say, no, they have proven that they're a danger to society, so we have a responsibility to protect the innocent, which is where I come in, and I'm very strong on that. So I recognized that I wanted to see a change. So I got involved. I ran for office, which now puts me in a position to be able to meet some key individuals and be able to work with others for the change that I'm hoping to be able to see to bring that balance back. So for those that would want to be able to get involved, it's possible to do it just in your local government. There are different groups or boards that meet that involve crime in either your city or your county. And oftentimes what it is that I see, and it's not just me, it's law enforcement, and judges that are involved. The other side always shows up. They are always there, so they are being represented. It's really hard to get victims and their families involved. And I understand it's re-traumatizing for us. That's why. It's very, very, very hard to face that. But I would say that if they find the courage to do that, number one is very healing for a lot of people. It may not be for everybody.
Right.
There are some that just moving on and doing what they need to do for themselves is what they need. But for others that are just kind of feeling still victimized, feeling as if, they didn't get justice, this is one way, for them to be able to advocate not only for themselves, but for future victims. It's kind of like when I worked on that law reform for child sexual assault. I knew that it wasn't going to be retroactive. So my focus was never justice for me. My focus was seeing those little kids that I knew that, 4 out of 6 girls, 1 out of 5 boys or something, were going to potentially be sexually assaulted. So that was my why. So when you think about, if you're that person that has had something happen, number one, it's not your fault. Number two, you don't have to accept, just get over it. That's just how it is. But you do have to figure out what your why is. You do have to figure out what you would like to see. And then take action on that. You can be kind, and my why is, like I said, my goal has never been to put anybody in jail. My goal has been to work on a justice system that puts out a strong message. There's accountability there, and that's a powerful motivator. So this is to draw the line to say, this is wrong, and if you step over, there's going to be consequences. Doesn't mean it's permanent, but it does mean don't do it. And we really mean it. So I think that's fair. When I work on things, I genuinely strive to be fair. And I also learned while I was in the legislature, so many times legislation will come up, and I ask the question when I'm sitting here and I'm reading through all these pages, and I'm saying, if we're going to pass a law, shouldn't it be that the average person should be able to follow it? Not that we pass the law and then we figure out how they're going to be able to do it afterwards. We let somebody else figure that out. So that to me is also another huge part of that, that maybe you wouldn't be the person to run for office, but you could certainly find, your representatives or even reach out to victims groups, and you could offer your talents, what are you good at? And you would be surprised how healing that really is. I mean, when you talk about, oftentimes, especially if it's rape, there's a reason we call that soul murder. There's a reason that a lot of people may commit suicide, or their lives are just never the same. And I can just tell you from having been, that point, I remember being that person where it just felt like every bit of the life drained out of me. I didn't feel like I had anything left. I was a shell. And I got to tell you, if I'd been in a car accident, I don't think I would have fought. And it wasn't that I didn't love my family. It was just that I was in so much pain, and it was 24 hours a day. And I didn't know how to get out. But you've made that transition. That's right.
And I think that's a very powerful message for people to hear. And you've made that transition not just as an activist, but now into the legislature, where you're actually one of the people involved in actually making that difference. And
and I think that's important, because a lot of times if somebody has been victimized, especially if it's rape, it's somehow or another you get that feeling, that it's your fault. You should have been able to do something. Or maybe you're less than now. You get that victim, that you're a victim. And, it's changing that message. You're a survivor. If you survived it, you're a survivor. And so I never hesitate to hold my head up high, knowing what I have survived, and to be that strong woman, for other people that I know that are out there struggling. It doesn't matter if it's male or female, it makes no difference. That struggle is real.
Well, thank you for representing victims in Olympia and being such a strong advocate on this issue. And I, as always, as strong activist and somebody who supports activists, I'd like to see that transition occur. And it's fun to see somebody get into office and really go toe to toe on these issues in such a strong way. Thank you so much for taking the time, and look forward to seeing you in Olympia some more, fighting on these issues. And with that, thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next time with our next interview.